American national government. This is Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 2, the American Constitution. In this segment, we can try to understand the disagreement amongst the delegates and the compromises that were reached at the Constitutional Convention. Now, as we saw with this young republic, there was a great deal of conflict that needed to be dealt with, and most individuals who are involved politically arrange themselves into one of two parties, either the Federalists or the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were the manufacturers, the merchants, the professionals, and the farmer soldiers, and they're primarily concentrated in the cities. Whereas the Anti-Federalists tended to be the subsistence farmers, the small businessmen, the artisans, the laborers, and the debtors. So there is oftentimes coming into conflict over what the future of this new country should be, especially after the failure of the Articles of Confederation. Now, there was a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland, that was convened to discuss the problems of interstate trade, but the majority of those who met were Federalists, and it was seen as a failure because it really didn't address the issues. Now, very soon thereafter, there was Shays' Rebellion, which was an outbreak of an armed revolt by farmers in western Massachusetts. And what they were doing is they were resisting state efforts to seize their property for failure to pay their taxes and their debts, which in turn was related to their inability to be paid for their labors during the American Revolutionary War. So what we saw is that there are a great deal of group rivalries and movement for a convention in light of this conflict that was boiling under in the United States. So what we had is the Constitutional Convention. And what we'll go through here is looking at the founders, the agreement, disagreement, and the compromise of the convention, and the limited role that religion played in the founding of the new country, as well as what the draft constitution did and the Articles of Confederation, how they compared, and finally the ratification campaign that followed. Now, the founders were overwhelmingly Federalist delegates, and so going into the Constitutional Convention, the Anti-Federalists smelled a rat, so not many of them went. They thought if they didn't go, then there wouldn't be a rationale to go ahead and change this government. So the Anti-Federalists thought, as a result, that the mandate would be limited to revising the articles and that they'd be able to vote against it. However, in an incredible move, what happened is those people who went to the Constitutional Convention ended up drafting a new government entirely. Now, the first plan that was proposed was the Virginia Plan. And the idea for this, which formed the basis of the Constitution and presented by James Madison of Virginia, was that there would be two bodies of representatives. You would have a lower body. It was directly elected, a House of Representatives, directly elected by the general public. And then a body above that would be elected by the representatives at the state level. And this is James Madison. Now, Madison's Virginia Plan, which called for the bicameral representation, was based upon population. And of course, it favored the large states, as Virginia was. Now, in response to this, the New Jersey Plan was proposed, and the idea was a one-house unicameral legislature that provided equal representation by each of the states. And of course, this was favored by the small states. Now, the compromise that came about was the Connecticut Compromise, and this is what we see currently. It proposed a two-house legislature, one that was based on population, and the other that represented the states equally. And so what we see is two senators and representatives that are based upon the population of each state. Now, as part of this, there was the 3/5 Compromise, and this was the slave-holding states were able to get the agreement to count each of their slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation and taxation. Now, this is one of the major flaws, as we saw less than 100 years later when we dealt with this in the Civil War, is the slavery issue. Now, beyond this, we saw a limited role for religion. The few references that were made to religion suggest that the founders viewed it as belonging to the private rather than the public sphere. And this is basically based upon the idea that previously the New England Puritanism and the state-supported Anglican Church that was very powerful was actually decreasing in power and importance due to a strong evangelical movement, a revival movement that spawned the Baptist and the Methodist denominations that we know. And it was socially subversive, albeit not politically subversive, in the sense that it focused on equality for all. The idea that religion was solely an individual, personal thing and rightly was kept out of the public sphere. Now, as we see with this, we see such things as Article 6, Section 3, stating that members of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of both state and federal government shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution, but no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office. So the oath can be a religious oath, or the affirmation can be just an affirmation, which has no religious connections. Now, the draft Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and the comparison that comes about suggests that there is a structure, function, and procedures of government. And when we look at the structure, functions, and procedures of government, the Articles were inadequate on all three of them. While both of them set up representative forms of government, and both of them were founded on the notion of governance with consent of the governed, the Articles were lacking centralized power that was quick and able to respond to external threats. So the Constitution gave Congress sole authority to raise army and navy, levy and collect taxes, coin money, and this is very important, especially as we saw trade wars between the states, regulate interstate commerce. The Constitution also established independent executive and judicial branches, which, as we'll see later on, is very important for the functioning of our government with checks and balances. So, continue with the comparison. Under the Constitution, there are longer terms of office for the members of Congress, and there was an exclusion of term limits and the recall for the members of Congress. Now, the members of the House were, of course, directly elected, and this requires a simple majority in each chamber for most actions in Congress. So the strongest argument against the Constitution was the definite protection of individual liberties from encroachment by government. Now, the ratification campaign itself required the approval of 9 states, and while all eventually signed this Constitution, the Federalists indeed had some advantages. The majority of the delegates at the convention were Federalists. There were endorsements of George Washington, who of course was a towering figure both figuratively and physically, and Benjamin Franklin, who was an intellectual powerhouse as well as being rather humorous. And on top of this, there was a concrete positive plan that was being proposed that would allow this new country to survive threats from overseas. And that was American national government.